My name is Jackson Riley, and for the better part of a decade, I wore the khaki and green of the National Park Service with a deep sense of pride. I was a park ranger, a steward of the wild places, a man who found more solace in the whisper of wind through pine trees than in the clamor of any city. My life had been one of order, of predictable seasons, of tracking wildlife and educating hikers on the importance of leaving no trace. It was a good life, a meaningful one, until it wasn't. The sudden loss of my wife, Sarah, in a senseless car accident shattered that order, replacing the peaceful quiet of the forest with a roaring silence in my heart. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, became a gallery of shared memories, each trail and vista a painful reminder of what I had lost. I couldn't escape her ghost in the familiar woods of Colorado, so I sought an escape of a different kind: isolation. True, profound, and absolute isolation. That's how I found myself accepting a position that most would consider a form of self-imposed exile. I took a job as a fire lookout for the Florida Forest Service, stationed at the Okehaven Tower, a relic from the 1950s, planted deep within the sprawling, untamed wilderness of the Apalachicola National Forest. The posting was for 6 months, from the blistering peak of summer through the humid, mosquito, thick autumn. The pay was modest, but the promise of solitude was priceless. My superiors from the NPS had been concerned, of course. They spoke of grief counseling, of taking time off, of not running away from my pain. But I wasn't running away. I was running toward a place where the noise in my head might finally be drowned out by the sheer, overwhelming presence of nature itself. I imagine endless days spent watching the horizon, reading stacks of books, and letting the sun and the silence bake the sorrow out of me. Florida, I thought, was far enough away, and different enough from the mountains I knew, to be a true reset. I had no idea that I was trading a familiar, gentle haunting for something far, far older. The journey to the tower was an ordeal in itself. After a long flight, and a drive that took me from the bustling civilization of Tallahassee to progressively smaller towns, I met my short-term supervisor, a man named Henderson, at a dusty ranger station on the edge of the forest. He was a portly man with a sun-beaten face and a wary expression, as if he'd seen too many eager newcomers like me. He handed me the keys to a battered government pickup truck and a map with a single, meandering line snaking into a vast green expanse. "The man you're replacing, Dale, is still up there," Henderson said, his voice a low drawl. "He'll walk you through the basics. Radio protocols, weather reports, the usual. He's been out there a while. Don't mind his ways." The drive that followed was a descent into another world. The paved road quickly gave way to gravel, then to a deeply rutted dirt track that was more suggestion than road. The familiar pines of the north were replaced by a dense, suffocating tapestry of cypress, tupelo, and ancient live oaks, draped in ghostly Spanish moss. The air grew thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the sweet, cloying scent of unseen blossoms. It was a primeval place, humming with an energy that felt both vibrant and deeply menacing. The sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. Every so often, the track would cross a stretch of blackwater swamp, the water as still and dark as polished obsidian, hiding whatever lurked beneath its surface. The sounds were a constant, layered symphony, the incessant buzz of insects, the guttural croak of frogs, the cry of a hawk circling high above. It was a world away from the crisp, clean air of the Rockies. This was a place that felt ancient, a place that had swallowed people whole and barely registered their passing. After nearly 2 hours of jostling and navigating the treacherous track, I saw it, rising from a small, man-made clearing. The Oakhaven Tower was a skeletal finger of rust, red steel pointing accusingly at the sky. It stood 100 feet tall, a lonely sentinel in a sea of green. The clearing around its base was overgrown with weeds, and a small, dilapidated cabin sat nearby, its windows dark and empty. The whole place radiated an aura of profound neglect and loneliness. As I parked the truck, the cabin door creaked open and a man emerged, squinting in the harsh sunlight. This had to be Dale. He was wary and thin, with a leathery, sun-wrinkled face and a wild mane of gray hair. His eyes, however, were what struck me the most. They were pale blue, washed out and perpetually wide, darting around as if he were constantly scanning for unseen threats. He moved with a stiff, cautious gait, like an animal wary of a trap. "You the new fella?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Jackson Riley." "Jack," I said, extending a hand. He stared at it for a moment before giving it a brief, dry shake. His skin was like parchment. "Dale," he said, and that was all. He turned and began walking me toward the base of the tower. "Henderson, send the supplies." "In the truck. He said you'd show me the ropes." "Ain't many ropes to show," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the canopy. "Watch the horizon. Report smoke. Simple." He showed me the generator, the well for water, and the propane tanks for the cabin's small stove. His explanations were curt, clipped, and devoid of any warmth. He seemed desperate to leave, his movements hurried and anxious. Finally, we stood at the base of the tower, looking up the long, steep flight of metal stairs that zigzagged their way to the lookout cab at the top. "The real work's up there," he said, a strange inflection in his voice. "Everything you need to know is up there." The climb was unnerving. The steel frame groaned and swayed with every step, the wind whistling through the girders. With each level I ascended, the world below shrank, and the vast, undifferentiated wilderness stretched out to the horizon in every direction. It was a breathtaking and humbling sight, a true ocean of trees. When we finally reached the top, and he pushed open the heavy trapdoor, the view from inside the cab was even more staggering. It was a single 10 by 10 foot room, enclosed in glass panels on all 8 sides, offering a 360-degree panorama. In the center stood a circular map table with an Osborne fire fender, a classic brass sighting device. A radio console sat on a small desk, along with a logbook, and a cot was folded against one wall. The air was stale and smelled of dust and sweat. Dale walked me through the radio check in procedure, pointing to the list of frequencies taped to the desk. Morning and evening check-ins on Channel 1. Weather reports on Channel 3 every 4 hours. That's it. Don't use the other channels. Especially not after dark. Just don't. His tone was emphatic, almost pleading. I nodded, assuming it was just a quirk of local protocol. He then gestured to the logbook, its pages filled with his spidery, cramped handwriting. Log every call. Log every weather reading. Log any smoke you see. And log anything else. Anything else? I asked. Like what? Sightings of rare birds. Dale's wide eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond wariness in them. It was fear. Pure, undiluted fear. He didn't answer my question directly. Instead, he walked over to a small, dented locker in the corner and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. It was yellowed with age. Its typewritten text faded. He handed it to me. This came with the tower, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The guy before me. He gave it to me, just like his predecessor gave it to him. He told me it was the most important piece of equipment up here. More important than the radio, more important than the fire finder. I looked down at the sheet. At the top, in bold, capital letters, were the words OACVR. Raules foar survival. I chuckled, thinking it was some kind of joke. A prank played on the new guy. Rules for survival. A little dramatic, don't you think? Dale didn't smile. He just stared at me with those haunted eyes. You follow them, he said, his voice low and intense. You follow them to the letter. You don't question them. You don't try to understand them. You just do what it says. Your life depends on it. His gravity was unsettling, but I was still convinced it was an elaborate gag. I began to read the list. 1. Secure and bolt the trapdoor no later than sunset. Do not open it for any reason until the sun has fully risen. The sounds from below are not what they seem. After dark, use only the approved radio channels for official communication. If you hear a voice on any other frequency, especially one that whispers your name, turn the radio off immediately, and do not turn it back on until morning. 3. You may hear whistling on the wind at night, a simple 7-note tune. Do not whistle it back. Do not acknowledge it in any way. It is listening for a response. 4. The glass panels act as mirrors in the dark. From time to time, you may see a reflection in the glass that is not in the room with you. Should this happen, do note turn around. Do not look away from the reflection. Stare directly at it, without fear, until it fades from the glass. It feeds on panic. 5. Between the hours of 300 a.m. and 400 a.m., you may hear a woman weeping in the clearing below the tower. It is a trap. Do not shine your light on it. Do not call out to her. Above all, do not go down to help. 6. Never eat the food you find left on the stairs. It is not a gift. 7. If you wake up and find all the maps on the floor, you have one warning. Leave the tower for the day. Go to the cabin, lock the door, and do not return until the next sunrise, no matter what you hear outside. I finished reading, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. This was far more elaborate than any simple hazing ritual. The specificity, the chilling details. It was genuinely creepy. I looked up at Dale, who, was already moving toward the trapdoor, his small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "You can't be serious, Dale," I said, forcing a laugh. "I've been here for 2 seasons," he said, not looking at me. "I'm alive because I followed the rules. The man I replaced was here for 5. The one before him, they found his logbook. He wrote about how he thought the rules were nonsense. That was his last entry. Without another word, he descended the ladder, his footsteps echoing on the metal rungs until they faded into silence. I was alone. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it was lost on me. I stood in the center of the glass room, 100 feet in the air, the list of rules clutched in my hand. The wind picked up, rattling the glass panes and making the whole tower groan like a dying beast. I spent the next hour trying to rationalize it. Dale was clearly suffering from extreme isolation-induced paranoia. Bush crazy, they called it up north. He'd probably written the list himself, a product of a lonely mind playing tricks on itself. I was a man of science and reason. I dealt with facts, with observable phenomena. Weeping women, phantom reflections, cursed food. It was the stuff of campfire tales, not reality. I made my dinner, a can of chili heated on a hot plate, and tried to enjoy the spectacular sunset. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The familiar shapes of the trees dissolved into monstrous silhouettes against the fading light. The symphony of insects and frogs intensified, a wall of sound that was both hypnotic and unnerving. I did as the first rule dictated and bolted the heavy trapdoor, more for peace of mind than out of any real belief in the warning. I made my scheduled radio call to Henderson, my voice sounding small and insignificant against the vast, dark emptiness. For a few hours, nothing happened. I read a book. The silence in the cab broken only by the rustle of pages and the creak of the tower swaying in the wind. My skepticism returned, stronger this time. I felt foolish for letting the old man's spooky stories get to me. Around 11 p.m., I decided to turn in. I was exhausted from the journey and the emotional weight of the past few months. I lay on the cot, staring up at the ceiling, my mind drifting. The wind was a constant presence, a low moan that seemed to carry whispers from miles away. And then I heard it, faint at first, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. A whistle. It was a simple, clear, 7-note tune that rose and fell with the gusts of wind. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. My blood ran cold. I sat bolt upright, every muscle in my body tensed. Rule 3: do not whistle it back. Do not acknowledge it. It was just the wind, I told myself. The wind moving through the steel, girders through a crack in a window pane, creating a fluke of a sound. It had to be. But the tune repeated, exactly the same as before. Melodic, intentional. My heart hammered against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, focusing on the rational explanations. But the sound persisted, a playful, patient, and utterly terrifying melody, weaving its way through the night. I was a ranger. I had faced down bears and mountain lions. I had slept alone in the deepest wilderness. I had never felt a fear like this. After what felt like an eternity, the whistling stopped, as abruptly as it had begun. The silence it left behind was somehow heavier, more menacing. I stayed frozen on the cot, straining my ears, but there was only the wind. Eventually, my exhaustion began to outweigh my fear. I convinced myself again that it was a trick of the wind and my overactive imagination, fueled by Dale's absurd list. I lay back down, but sleep would not come. I must have drifted off at some point, because I was startled awake by a different sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching. It was coming from the trapdoor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like a branch, I thought. Maybe the wind was knocking a loose cable against the metal. But the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. It sounded like fingernails. My breath hitched in my throat. I remembered the first rule: do not open it for any reason until the sun has fully risen. The sounds from below are not what they seem. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The scratching stopped. Silence, I waited, my ears ringing. And then a new sound. A soft, wet thump against the glass panel to my right. And another, and another. I slowly, hesitantly, turned my head. The vast, inky blackness of the night was pressed against the glass. But in the faint starlight, I could see them. Handprints. Dozens of them. Appearing on the glass, one after another. They were large, too large to be human, and they were smeared and wet, as if the hands were coated in mud or blood. They started at the bottom of the panel and were slowly, methodically, climbing their way up the outside of my glass cage 100 feet in the air. Panic seized me, cold and sharp. My first instinct was to scream, to scramble for the radio, to turn on my flashlight. But as I lurched to my feet, my headlamp beam cut across the room and hit the glass panel directly opposite, the one with the handprints. And I saw it. For a split second, in the reflection, I saw the room behind me. The cot, the desk, the map table. And standing next to the map table, a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long. Its form shrouded in what looked like wet leaves and dark soil. It was turned away from me, its head cocked as if listening. Then it began to turn its head toward my reflection. Dale's voice screamed in my memory. Rule Fate 4. You may see a reflection in the glass that is not in the room with you, Ardo. Now turn around. Do not look away from the reflection. Stare directly at it. My body had already started to turn. My muscles screamed in protest as I forced myself to stop, to freeze. My gaze was locked on the reflection in the glass. The figure in the reflection slowly turned its head, and I saw a face that was a pale, featureless oval, smooth like a stone from a riverbed. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank, white mask of a face. And yet, I could feel it looking at me. I could feel its gaze through the reflection, a cold, ancient intelligence filled with a hunger I could not comprehend. I stood there, paralyzed, my breath a ragged gasp. My world had shrunk to that 10 by 10-foot room, and the impossible thing sharing it with me. The scratching had stopped. The handprints had stopped appearing. There was only the sound of the wind, the pounding of my own heart, and the silent, sightless stare of the thing in the mirror. And the rule, the insane, life, saving rule, echoing in my mind, stared directly at it, without fear, until it fades from the glass. However, we soon discovered why. But how do you stare without fear that has just torn your entire understanding of reality to shreds? Time ceased to have meaning. Seconds stretched into glacial epochs, each one a monument to pure, unadulterated terror. My universe had contracted to the space between my eyes and the pane of glass in front of me, where the impossible reflection held me captive. Every rational thought, every memory of a world governed by logic and physics, had been annihilated, replaced by a single, screaming imperative: do not turn around. My heart hammered a frantic, syncopated rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat for ritual I didn't understand. My lungs burned. Starved for air, I was too terrified to draw. I could feel the muscles in my neck and back screaming, coiled tight and ready to spin me around. Face the thing that was, by all accounts, standing just a few feet behind me. But the rule, Dale's desperate, whispered warning, was a dam holding back the flood of instinct. I forced myself to study the reflection, to absorb the details of the nightmare. The creature's form was indistinct, a mockery of a human silhouette woven from shadow, damp earth, and decaying leaves. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles that suggested broken bones, yet it stood with an unnatural stillness. The most horrific part was its head, that smooth, pale, featureless oval. It was a void, a canvas wiped clean of identity, yet it projected an aura of immense, ancient malice. I felt its attention on me, a palpable pressure against my mind, a cold, curious probing. It was an intelligence that did not operate on any human level. It was alien, primeval, and it was in my room. A wave of nausea washed over me as I fought the urge to vomit. The command from the rule, stared directly at it, without fear, was an impossibility. Fear was all I had. It was the air I was breathing, the blood in my veins. But I tried. I forced my trembling legs to lock, my gaze to remain steady. I tried to project an image of defiance, to mimic the courage the rule demanded. I imagine it was like facing a predator in the wild. You don't show weakness. You don't break eye contact. But this was no bear or wolf. This was a violation of nature itself. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the reflection began to change. The edges of the figure started to blur, to lose their cohesion, like ink bleeding into water. The featureless face seemed to recede, to dissolve back into the shadowed interior of the reflected room. It wasn't moving away. It was simply unbecoming. The process was agonizingly slow. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was a trick, that the instant I relaxed, it would solidify again, perhaps no longer content to remain a mere reflection. I held my breath, my eyes watering from the strain of not blinking, watching as the last vestiges of the thing's long, limbed shape faded into the reflection of the far wall. And then, it was gone. The reflection was normal again. Just me, a wild-eyed, ghost, pale man in a headlamp, standing in a small, glass-walled room. The strength fled my body in a single, violent rush. I collapsed onto the floor, my limbs shaking uncontrollably. A strangled sob escaped my lips, and I scrambled backward on my hands and knees until my back hit the solid wood of the map table's base. I finally allowed myself to whip my head around, scanning the empty room with my headlamp beam. Nothing. The cot was empty. The space by the desk was clear. There was no one there. There was nothing but me and the oppressive, listening silence. I was alone. But I wasn't. The room felt tainted, violated. The very air was thick with the memory of its presence. Sleep was no longer an option. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in a corner, my back pressed against the wall, a heavy-duty flashlight clutched in my white, knuckled grip. I watched the glass, all 8 panels, my head on a constant, paranoid swivel. Every creak of the tower in the wind, every skittering sound that could have been an insect or a mouse, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I listened for the whistling, but it did not return. The wet handprints on the outside of the glass remained silent, glistening testimony to the night's events, confirming that I hadn't lost my mind. The first hint of dawn was the most beautiful sight I have ever witnessed. A faint, gray line on the eastern horizon that slowly bled into soft pinks and oranges, pushing back the absolute blackness of the night. As the sun climbed, its rays spilling across the endless canopy of trees, the terror began to recede, leaving behind a residue of exhaustion and disbelief. Light brought with it a fragile sense of security, a return to the world I understood. When the sun was fully above the horizon, I cautiously unbolted the trapdoor, half expecting something to be waiting for me on the stairs. There was nothing. I made my 8 a.m. radio call to Henderson, my voice a hoarse, shaky croak that I tried to disguise with a cough. O'Cavan to base. Morning check-in. All clear? Roger that. O'Cavan. Henderson's voice crackled back, tinny and distant. You sound a little rough around the edges, son. Everything all right up there? I hesitated, the words to describe the night's horror bubbling up in my throat. A thing made of shadow with no face was in my room. It climbed 100 feet up the tower and left handprints on the glass. How could I say that? They would pull me out. Immediately. They would send me to a psychiatrist. They would think I was insane. Dale's words echoed in my mind. You don't question them. You don't try to understand them. Maybe talking about them was just as bad. Just a rough night's sleep. I lied, the words tasting like ash. Still getting used to the tower swaying. It's a long way up. You'll get your sea legs, Henderson said, though I thought I detected a note of something in his voice. Not suspicion, but perhaps a knowing wariness. Base out. The moment the radio went silent, the feeling of isolation crashed back down on me. I was completely, utterly on my own with this. My first instinct was to pack my bags, climb down that tower, and drive until the tires melted off the truck. But 2 things stopped me. The first was a stubborn, ingrained pride. I was not a man who ran from a challenge. The second, and more powerful, was a burgeoning curiosity. A terrifying need to understand what was happening in this place. And there was only one place to look for answers. I retrieved the laminated list of rules and spread it on the map table. Then, I opened the logbook Dale had left behind. His entries were mostly mundane weather, radio checks, notes on cloud formations. But As I flipped back through the pages, I started to notice a pattern. Sprinkled amongst the routine entries were cryptic, single-line notes, written in a different, more agitated hand. July 14C, the whistling again. Closer this time. July 2030 woke up to prints on the west, facing glass. Had to follow Rule 4. Almost didn't. August put away the weeper. Hardest night yet. Stayed away from the light. August 12. Maps on the floor. Spent the day in the cabin. The scratching on the door was new. My blood ran cold. It was all there. Every rule had a corresponding entry in Dale's log. He hadn't been paranoid. He had been documenting his survival. He had experienced the same things, the same impossible horrors. I flipped further back, into the entries from his first season. The notes were more frantic, filled with more questions. June 5's first season. Heard a man calling for help from the swamp. Radioed it in. Henderson told me to ignore it, said it was a swamp gas echo. He's lying. Why is he lying? June 18th. Found a dead deer at the base of the tower. Its neck was broken, but there were no other marks on it. It was placed directly in the center of the clearing. July 20th, something whispered my name over the radio. Channel 7. Sounded like my mother. I almost answered. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. This wasn't a haunting confined to the tower. It was the entire forest. It was an ecosystem of nightmares, and I was living at its heart. The rules weren't just a guide to surviving the tower. They were a guide to surviving this specific, malevolent corner of the world. And the people at the Forest Service, like Henderson, they knew. They knew, and they still sent people out here. Dale wasn't the first. The man before him, the one who died. What had he seen? What rule had he broken? I spent the rest of the day in a state of feverish anxiety. I cleaned the handprints from the glass, scrubbing until my knuckles were raw. The substance came off like a mixture of mud and thick, dark sap, and it smelled faintly of the grave. Every gust of wind made me jump. I scanned the tree line constantly, searching for any sign of movement. The forest felt different now. It was no longer just a wilderness, it was a lair. The ancient trees with their draping moss seemed like silent, watching old men. The dark water of the swamps seemed to hold secrets far older than humanity. As the sun began its slow descent, a new kind of dread began to build in my stomach. Last night, I had been an ignorant skeptic. Tonight, I was a believer. I knew what the darkness held. The thought of the coming night was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. I checked the bolt on the trapdoor a dozen times. I made sure my headlamp had fresh batteries. I positioned the logbook and the list of rules on the small desk, next to my cot, my new Bible. I made my evening call to Henderson, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. O'Cavan to base. All clear before sunset. Signing off, Roger, O'Cavan. Have a quiet night. A quiet night. The phrase was a bitter joke. As the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon, the forest came alive with its chorus of insects and frogs. But tonight, I could hear something else beneath it. A low, expectant hum. The world was holding its breath, waiting. I sat on my cot, my back to the wall, and waited with it. I didn't know what would come. The whistling, The reflection. Or would it be the next horror on the list? Rule 5. Between the hours of 300 a.m. and 400 a.m., you may hear a woman weeping in the clearing below the tower. It is a trap. Do not go down to help. The hours ticked by, each one a small victory. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. The tower groaned around me. The wind whispered against the glass. My eyes burned with fatigue, but I didn't dare close them. My senses were stretched to their breaking point. Then, at 3:17 a.m., according to the glowing face of my watch, I heard it. It started faintly from the clearing directly below the tower. It was the unmistakable sound of a woman crying. Not a loud, hysterical wail, but a soft, heartbreaking sob. Filled with such profound grief and despair that my heart immediately ached in sympathy. It sounded so real, so human. My mind flashed to Sarah, to the raw, soul-crushing grief I had felt after her death. This sound was the auditory embodiment of that pain. My first, overwhelming instinct was to help. It was ingrained in me as a ranger, as a human being. Someone was down there, hurt, lost, and terrified. I grabbed my powerful flashlight, my thumb hovering over the switch. I could shine it down, see who was there. I could call out, let them know they weren't alone. I could go down and help her. But the rule held me back, a cold hand on my shoulder. It is a trap. Do not shine your light on it. Do not call out to her. Above all, do not go down to help. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. And then, through the tears, a voice emerged, choked with anguish. Please, the voice cried, and it was a voice I knew. Jack, please help me. I'm so scared. It's so dark down here. It was Sarah's voice. The world stopped. It was not a metaphorical halt, but a complete and total cessation of everything. The wind, the groaning tower, the frantic beating of my own heart. It all vanished, replaced by the sound of that voice. Sarah's voice. It was a sound I hadn't heard in 8 months. A sound I thought was lost to me forever. Preserved only in the fading echoes of my memory. To hear it now, rising from the oppressive darkness, 100 feet below, was like a physical blow. It bypassed reason, logic, and the cold, hard, won terror of the past 2 nights. It struck directly at the gaping wound in my soul. Jack. The voice sobbed again, and the perfect, agonizing familiarity of it sent a tremor through my entire body. It was her. It was the way her voice would catch in her throat when she was truly frightened. It was the exact pitch, the exact cadence. My hand, which had been frozen over my flashlight, now trembled with a desperate, new purpose. The rule. It is a trap. Screamed in my mind, a frantic, tinny alarm bell against a hurricane of emotion. But the sound of my dead wife's voice was a voice of nature. I don't know where I am, she cried, her words punctuated by heart-wrenching sobs. I woke up here. It's so cold, Jack. I'm lost. Please, just shine your light. Let me see you. I need to see you. My fingers tightened on the flashlight. My thumb pressed against the switch. It would be so easy. Just one flick of a button. I could lean over the railing, cut through the darkness, and see. What? See Sarah. Standing in the clearing. The rational part of my brain, The small, terrified part that had survived the reflection knew it was impossible. Sarah was gone. I had identified her body. I had sat by her grave. But this thing, this ancient evil that haunted the forest, it had found the deepest, most protected part of me, and was now twisting a knife in it. It had learned. It had listened to the whispers of my own grief, stricken heart, and had fashioned a lure of exquisite cruelty. "Don't you remember this place, Jack?" The voice pleaded, shifting its tactic. It became softer, laced with a desperate nostalgia. The little clearing by the river, back in Colorado, where we had that picnic, our first anniversary. You made me that silly daisy chain. You promised you'd always keep me safe. Please, Jack, keep me safe now. A memory, so vivid it stole my breath, exploded behind my eyes. The sun on my face, the smell of pine needles. Sarah laughing as I fumbled with the flowers, her eyes sparkling with a love so pure, it was the foundation of my world. How could it know that? It was a memory I hadn't shared with anyone. A secret, sacred moment. The thought that this thing had somehow plucked it from my mind, that it was now soiling it by using it as bait, filled me with a fresh wave of horror that was somehow colder and sharper than raw fear. It was a violation. I stumbled back from the glass, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a cry. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it was no use. The voice was inside my head now, as much as it was outside. "Help me, Jack," it shrieked, the desperation returning, amplified. "It's coming! Oh God, I can hear it in the trees! It's coming for me! Don't let it take me again! Don't leave me alone in the dark." The sound of her terror was my undoing. I was on my feet, lunging for the trapdoor handle. The rule, Dale's logbook, the faceless reflection. It all meant nothing. All that mattered was that Sarah was in danger, and I had to get to her. My fingers fumbled with the heavy steel bolt, my knuckles scraping against the cold metal. I could hear her screaming my name now, a raw, panicked sound that tore me to pieces. "It is a trap." The words of the rule surfaced again, this time not as a warning, but as an anchor. I froze, my hand on the bolt. My breath came in ragged, painful gasps. I was a park ranger. I was trained to assess situations, to act on facts, not emotion. The fact was, my wife was dead. The fact was, I was in a place where the laws of nature were broken every night. The fact was, I had a list of rules, written in the metaphorical blood of those who came before me. And Rule Fane 5 was screaming at me to stop. With a guttural roar of anguish and effort, I ripped my hand away from the bolt, as if it were red, hot iron. I staggered back to the far corner of the room, slid down the wall, and clamped my hands over my ears. I couldn't block out the sound, but it was a gesture of defiance, a desperate attempt to reclaim some small part of my own mind. I sat there, curled into a ball, while the voice of the woman I loved was tortured in the darkness below. It begged, it pleaded, it screamed. It whispered our private jokes. It hummed the tune she always hummed while she cooked. It used every weapon in its arsenal, every memory it had stolen from me, to try and break me. It was an hour of pure, unadulterated psychological warfare. I wept silently, tears streaming down my face. my body shaking with the strain of my resistance. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than burying her. Harder than facing the faceless thing in the glass. This was a battle for my sanity, and I was losing. And then, at precisely 400 a.m., it stopped. Not faded away, but cut off, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that rushed in was absolute, a crushing void where the screams had been. The night returned to its normal rhythm. The wind, the insects, the creaking steel. But I knew it wasn't over. It was just resting. It was waiting for the next night. I did not move from my corner until the sun rose. I watched the dawn break with dead eyes, feeling hollowed out, scarred clean by the ordeal. The grief for Sarah, which had been a dull, constant ache, was now a raw, bleeding wound again, reopened and poisoned by the night's horror. When the sun was high, and the world felt marginally safer, I forced my aching body to its feet. It was time for the morning radio call. I don't know how I made my voice work, how I managed the simple words. O'Cavan to base. All clear. There was a longer pause than usual before Henderson replied. You sure about that, son?
You sound gone.
I'm here, I said, my voice flat. All clear. Roger that, O'Kevin. Base out. I stood there for a long time, staring at the radio. He knew. He didn't know the details, but he knew the nature of the night's trial. He knew what Rule 25 entailed. And he was still out there, in his safe office, while I was up here, being fed piece by piece to the monsters in his forest. A cold, hard anger began to smolder in the pit of my stomach. It was a welcome change from the terror and the grief. It was fuel. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a survivor, and I was going to keep surviving. With a newfound, grim resolve, I walked to the trapdoor. My hand hesitated on the bolt. After the night I'd had, I was terrified of what I might find. But I had to know. I had to face the day. I slid the bolt back and pushed the heavy door open. I peered down the long, zigzagging staircase, my eyes scanning each level. The stairs were empty. The clearing below was quiet, dappled in the morning sunlight, showing no sign of the torment that had taken place there just hours before. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. I took a deep breath of the humid morning air and began my descent. I needed to get to the cabin, to splash water on my face, to feel solid ground under my feet. I was halfway down the first flight of stairs when I saw it. Sitting on the metal landing of the next level down was a plate. A ceramic plate, the cheap, floral patterned kind you find in any diner. On the plate was a small stack of blueberry pancakes, a perfect pat of butter melting on top, with a small stream of syrup running down the side. Steam was still rising from them. Next to the plate was a thermos. I froze, my hand gripping the railing. My mind immediately jumped to the list. Rule Phase 6. Never eat the food you find left on the stairs. It is not a gift. This was a new test. After the psychological brutality of the weeping woman, this felt almost gentle, almost kind. But I knew better. It was just a different kind of poison. The pancakes were Sarah's favorite. She made them for us almost every Sunday. Blueberry. She always said the blueberries bursting in the batter were like little purple smiles. I stared at the plate, my stomach churning. I hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch. I was exhausted and starving. The smell of the pancakes, a phantom on the air or perhaps just a product of my memory, was intoxicating. It smelled like home. It smelled like love. It smelled like everything I had lost. This was the follow-up attack. The thing that pretended to be Sarah had failed to lure me out with fear and panic. So now, it was trying to lure me in with comfort and nostalgia. It was offering a gift, a seeming apology for the night's horrors. Here, you've been through so much. Have some breakfast. Rest. I thought of Dale's logbook. He hadn't made an entry for Rule Phase 6. Had he never encountered it? Or had the man before him, the one who died, been the one to fail this particular test? I imagined him, exhausted and broken, after a night like the one I just had, finding this comforting meal waiting for him. I could see him sitting on the stairs, gratefully devouring the pancakes, feeling a moment of peace before the poison, whatever it was, did its work. The anger from before returned, colder and sharper. I would not be that man. I would not let this place, this thing, win. Not like this. Slowly, deliberately, I continued my descent until I was standing on the landing, just a few feet from the plate. The pancakes looked perfect. The thermos was a cheerful red. It was the most menacing sight I had ever seen. Without touching the plate, without even getting any closer, I drew back my foot and kicked it as hard as I could. The plate flew off the landing, spinning through the air. It shattered against one of the tower's steel supports with a sharp crack. The pancakes splattered against the metal befalling, piece by piece, into the overgrown weeds 100 feet below. The thermos followed, tumbling end over end, until it hit the ground with a dull, metallic thud. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and triumph. I had passed another test. I had followed the rule. I looked down at the clearing, at the scattered remains of the gift. For a long moment, everything was still. And then, from the deep woods at the edge of the clearing, a sound came. It wasn't a whistle, or a cry, or a voice. It was a low, guttural growl of displeasure, a sound of pure, frustrated rage. It was the sound of a predator whose prey had just escaped the trap. And it was close. That roar vibrated to my very bones. It wasn't the sound of any animal I knew, not a bear or a cougar. It was the sound of spurned malevolence, a sound that said its patience had finally run out. The survival instinct, honed sharp over the past few nights, took immediate command of my body. I no longer considered going down to the cabin. The ground was now tantamount to jumping into an alligator pit. My only salvation was height, the glass fortress above the treetops. I spun around and scrambled back up the steel staircase, my footsteps clattering on the metal frame. I didn't dare look down, didn't dare look toward the tree line, where the sound had originated. I imagined something moving in the shadows, something roused to fury by my actions. When I reached the top, I threw myself through the trapdoor and slammed it shut. The heavy steel, bolt sliding into place, was a sharp, definitive sound that offered precious little reassurance. I scrambled back against the far wall, my heart hammering as if it would burst from my chest. I stared down at the tree line, trying to spot any movement, but everything was still. Only the leaves swayed in the wind. But the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I felt like a mouse in a glass cage, and the predator was circling below, waiting patiently. I knew tonight would be different. This would no longer be a psychological game. There would be no more whispers or illusions. Tonight, it was coming for me. Throughout the day, I was on high alert. I didn't dare leave the tower for a second. I ate cold, canned food, and drank warm water from a bottle, the hunger and exhaustion masked by a constant surge of adrenaline. I spent the day preparing. I dragged the heavy map table to barricade the trapdoor, knowing it wouldn't do much, but feeling slightly better for it. I checked my flashlight, the spare batteries, and the radio over and over. I reread the 7 rules again and again, especially the last one. 7. If you wake up and find all the maps on the floor, you have one warning. Leave the tower for the day. Go to the cabin, lock the door, and do not return until the next sunrise, no matter what you hear outside. This rule unsettled me the most. It was different from the others. The others were about defending myself within the tower. This one was about being driven out, forced into the flimsy, defenseless cabin. It was like being herded from a bunker into a slaughter pen. I prayed I wouldn't have to face that scenario. As the sun began to sink, the dread intensified. I made my evening radio call to Henderson, my voice a carefully controlled monotone. O'Cavan to base. Reporting in before sunset. All clear. Roger that. O'Cavan. Henderson's voice came back. Take care of yourself, Jack. His words seemed to hold a deeper meaning. It wasn't an order, but a personal warning. It told me that he knew, somehow, that this might be the worst night of all. Darkness crept in with an eerie silence. Tonight, there were no insects, no frogs, no night birds. It was an unnatural quiet, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to arrive. I sat huddled in a corner, clutching the small fire axe I'd found in a locker, its handle slick with sweat in my palm. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was better than nothing. The hours crawled by. 1 hour, 2. Nothing happened. No whistling. No weeping, no phantom reflections. The silence was more torturous than any scream. It made me start to doubt myself. Was I imagining it? Was the roar that morning just a normal animal sound I had misinterpreted? Then, just after midnight, it began. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration. I felt it through the steel floor of the tower, a low thrumming that grew steadily stronger, as if something of immense weight was walking toward the tower's base. Thump, thump. The low impacts resonated up the steel structure, each step making the tower tremble slightly. I crawled slowly to the edge of the glass and peered into the darkness below. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel its presence. It was circling the base of the tower, a deliberate, considering pace, like a predator studying its cage prey. Suddenly, the vibrations stopped. They were followed by a horrifying scraping sound, the shriek of metal on metal. It was climbing. I scrambled back into the center of the room, my heart seizing. The scraping grew louder, clearer, ascending the outer frame. I thought of the wet handprints from the first night. But this was no mere print. This was a tangible entity, and it was coming for me. The scraping stopped, level with the cab. Silence descended again. I held my breath, staring at the dark glass panels around me. Then one of the panes was struck with ferocious force.
Bear!
I cried out and jumped back as the entire tower shuddered from the impact. Bang! Another strike on a different pane. It was testing for a weak spot. It was trying to break in. Panic took over. I grabbed the radio, mashing the transmit button. Mayday! O'Cavan is under attack. Something is trying to break in! Send help! Please! Static hissed back. And then Henderson's voice came through, chillingly calm and detached. Turn off the radio, Jack. What? Did you hear me? It's getting in. I screamed back. Said turn it off. Henderson repeated. It can hear you. It'll only make it angrier. Turn it off and follow the rules. The line went dead. I stared at the radio in my hand, hopeless. He had cut me off. He had left me to die. I was truly, completely alone with this thing. The impacts began again, harder and faster now. Bang! 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 Cracks began to appear in the glass, terrifying spider webs of damage spreading with each blow. I knew I was going to die. I closed my eyes, waiting for the glass to shatter and for the thing to pour in. But then, the impact stopped. I opened my eyes cautiously. There was only the sound of the wind and my own heart hammering in my ears. I waited for a long time, but nothing else happened. It was gone. Or maybe it was just waiting. I survived until morning. I don't know how. I spent the rest of the night trembling, in the corner, staring at the fractured glass glittering in the first light of day. When the sun was fully up, I felt like the survivor of a catastrophic wreck, bruised in body and shattered in spirit. I knew I couldn't stay. This wasn't an escape from grief anymore, it was survival. I had to get out. My mind was made up. I would call Henderson, tell him I was leaving, and then I would drive out of this hellish forest and never look back. I staggered to the desk to grab the radio, and then I froze. My blood ran cold. On the floor, scattered all around my feet, were the maps. Weather charts, topographical maps. Fire grids. Every single one that had been neatly stacked on the desk was now strewn across the floor, as if swept off in a rage. If you wake up and find all the maps on the floor, you have one warning. Rule 87. The final warning. It hadn't left last night. It had gotten in. It had been in this room with me, while I was unconscious or passed out from exhaustion. It hadn't hurt me. It had just left its warning. It was playing a game. It was telling me, now it's your turn to run. A cold dread washed over me. I had no choice. I had to follow the rule. I grabbed my pack, shoving in a water bottle, my flashlight, and a couple of cans of food. I didn't dare look around the room for long. I pulled the desk away from the trapdoor, unbolted it, and threw it open. I ran down the stairs without looking back, feeling its eyes on me from the empty tower. I reached the cabin and threw myself inside, slamming and locking the door. I dragged an old wooden chair to wedge under the knob. The cabin smelled of mildew and decay. It felt 100 times less safe than the tower. I looked out the grimy window. The sun was still bright in the sky, but in this forest, the sunlight seemed to mean nothing. I spent the day sitting rigid on the floor, staring at the door. I heard the normal, daytime sounds of the forest, but I knew it was an illusion. As darkness began to fall again, the terrible silence returned, and then I heard it. The heavy tread of footsteps in the clearing, stopping right outside my cabin. I held my breath. Something scraped against the ground. Then a light scratching sound on the wooden door. I clapped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Then the doorknob began to turn. Jiggle, jiggle. It was trying to get in. The lock held. It shook the door with such violence that the whole cabin rattled. I scrambled to the far side of the room, my heart stopping. When shaking the door failed, it changed tactics. It began to speak in Henderson's voice. "Jack, open up. I'm here to help. I drove out to get you. We can leave together." I didn't answer. I knew it was a trap. "Jack, please!" This time, it was Dale's voice, the man I'd replaced. "It knows we're in here. Open the door, quick. Let me in." I remained silent, shaking uncontrollably. Then it used its final voice, the one that almost broke me. "Jack, honey." It was Sarah's voice, soft and full of love. "Open the door for me, sweetheart. It's all over. We can be together again. Just open the door." Tears streamed down my face. I wanted so desperately to believe it, to throw open the door and find her there. But I knew the truth. I sat there, listening to the voice of my dead wife. Wife begged me to open the door to my death, while something scraped and clawed at the outside of the cabin, waiting for me to break. That night passed like an eternity. I huddled in the darkness, using the memory of the real Sarah as a shield against the imitation outside. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the window, all the sounds stopped at once. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than anything that had come before. I waited until the sun was fully up, casting golden light across the clearing. I knew this was my only chance. I took a deep breath, unbolted the door, kicked the chair away, and burst out of the cabin. The clearing was eerily empty. The pickup truck sat on the far side, like it was across an ocean. I ran. I ran with everything I had. Every step felt like wading through mud. Every snap of a twig made my heart leap into my throat. I reached the truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I jumped in, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice. "Please," I whispered. On the third try, it roared to life. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, fishtailing on the dirt track. Before I left, I took one last look at the tower, and what I saw froze my blood. Standing in the top window was a tall, slender figure. The same silhouette I had seen in the reflection. Its smooth, featureless oval of a face was turned toward me. I drove away and didn't look back. The image burned into my mind. I reached the ranger station, a wreck of a man. Henderson was waiting outside, as if he knew I was coming. He didn't ask a single question. He just handed me an envelope with my pay and said, in a flat voice, "Some places, they just have teeth." I took the envelope without a word, got in my own car, and drove away from there, leaving the Florida woods behind. I had come here to escape the ghosts of memory, and had found something so much worse. I knew the scars from Oak Haven Tower would never fade. I was no longer haunted by the ghost of my wife, but by the living memory of something much, much older and infinitely more malevolent.